Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. You can check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web or at Safe Camp Audio on social media. I hope people have enjoyed the Summer Rewind series here that we've been going through in August into Labor Day. I think we're going to make that a regular thing. Am I trying to get some of the summer off? Absolutely. But also, I just hate the thought of people missing out on some of the awesome guest interviews that we had early in the history of the show when we obviously had way less listeners. So we'll probably keep that going next summer as well. We're going to have some great new guest interviews coming up in the next few weeks on the podcast, but I thought I would do a quick one this week with a little recap of some news and headlines around the country from the past month or so, a little summer recap. Let's start with a couple of things that unfolded on Capitol Hill over the summer, one of which was the effort to reauthorize Title 4B. So listeners, many of you on the child welfare side know there's two titles that refer to child welfare funding. One is 4E, that's an entitlement program through which a lot of money flows to states for foster care payments, for administration, adoption subsidies, and since the Family First Act passed in 2018, it's been available for foster care prevention services. And then there's 4B, which is a, sizable but much smaller capped amount of money that goes out to states kind of for both sides of the coin. You can do family preservation with some of the funds. You can do court improvement programs. 4B can be used for reunification services or post-adoption services, all kinds of things. It's overdue for reauthorization, and over the summer, there were sort of incremental bills that were being kind of stacked up alongside 4B reauthorization. The Work and Welfare Subcommittee of the House Ways and Means Committee moved a bill, which is now, I believe, passed the House and awaits action in the Senate, called the Protecting America's Children by Strengthening Families Act, which kind of folds in 4B reauthorization with 16 different legislative efforts, many of which we have reported on already in the imprint. So I'm just going to throw a bunch of links at you in the show notes, including to our summary of this. Just a few off the top, though, some of the bigger things that kind of made it into this package. One is a poverty prevention piece of legislation that was introduced by Chairman Jason Smith and Representative Gwen Moore from Wisconsin. That legislation would allow for the inclusion of concrete support, things like housing assistance, transportation, nutritional assistance, subsidies, basically things that are kind of financial in nature. Those would be added as allowable expenses under 4B in this reauthorization. As far as the Family First Prevention Services Act go, one challenge with Family First is that states are on the hook to conduct or help participate in conducting evaluations of services that they put on their list and get approved to use as part of foster care prevention services. This package puts $5 million in play for grants to conduct evaluations. As far as the Indian Child Welfare Act, there is legislation that Nancy Marie Spears has reported on for us that became part of this bill, and it would basically instruct the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services to provide technical assistance to states to help them live up to the tenets of the Indian Child Welfare Act, which was passed in 1978, at a time when up to a third of Indigenous children were being separated from their families. There's still not a lot of great eyes on the ground monitoring of compliance with that law. So that's what this gets to. And then just one other one, there's a lot of things in here. So, read the full summary that we produced if you would like to know all of it. But one other one I wanted to call out is there are child welfare plans that states have to submit periodically to the federal government. Those plans already have to, incorporate the input of, community-based organizations in the child welfare space, partners of the state agency. This bill would amend that to also require that state plans are informed by two other groups. One would be caregivers, and that's inclusive of birth parents, kinship caregivers, foster parents, and then young people who have lived experience in the system. So that's a pretty significant amendment to how states go about soliciting input to create their child welfare plans. So that is an actual piece of legislation making its way, possibly through to passage and signature by President Biden. Meanwhile, there was a White House convening on child welfare over the summer at which the administration took the opportunity to announce a few basically policy clarifications, I'm going to call it, that it made through the Child Welfare Policy Manual, which for most people is accessible by going to you can just type in to Google Child Welfare Policy Manual or CWPM. And what you get is sort of like, it's almost presented like a Q&A. Actually, it is literally presented like a Q&A that takes you through kind of the finer points of federal policy on child welfare. So they basically did a few of these that, again, we summarized for everybody, and we'll include the link to that in the show notes. Just kind of an overview. One was flexibility for tribes, making clear that tribes have added flexibility in how they, come up with their plans for use of Family First Prevention Services Acts. So they're permitted to make cultural adaptations to the programs that get approved either directly by tribes or by states. They made some clarifications around the fringe costs of prevention work, basically just saying that, yes, in fact, you can use the Title IV-E entitlement to kind of draw down funds to help out with the administrative costs around foster care prevention. Another clarification around costs that the feds will share in. They made clear that starting now, the federal government will pick up half the cost of doing background checks for both foster parents and kinship caregivers. You may remember from conversations that we've had on the podcast for the past several months that the Biden administration has laid out kind of a new path to licensing kin that can vary from the way that states and counties license foster parents otherwise. So this would actually open up federal funds to pay for background checks on both, because no matter what you do in terms of an alternate path to licensing relatives, everybody still needs to go through the background check process. And then last but not least, there's a clarification around the nexus of poverty and neglect. There is a kind of legislative effort afoot, both on the federal level and I would say on the state level as well, to change or amend, definitions of neglect to make clear and kind of hold poverty outside of neglect findings. The change made in the CWPM here kind of primes that conversation at the state level by making it clear, and I'm going to quote from what they put into the manual. A state statute may exempt specific circumstances or conditions, including poverty and income-related factors, from the definitions of child abuse and neglect. And then just one more thing from the Capitol Hill beat, and this is just a nod kind of to how congressional action can prompt local action or media coverage and how that influences it. The last headlines that we did for the summer back in July, we focused entirely on a hearing about residential foster care that was held by the Senate Finance Committee, which was conducted basically to announce the release of a very scathing report on the quality of services and safety at many residential programs. And one of the witnesses there was Reagan Stanford, who is the abuse neglect managing attorney at Disability Rights Arkansas. So part of what she spoke to were some of their oversight efforts and what they have found to be the case about the quality of services or lack thereof at some of the, in particular, Medicaid-funded psychiatric residential treatment facilities in Arkansas. Anyway, I say that to say I caught a headline out of Maine over the summer a little bit later. Actually, I think it was in early September. It turns out Maine sends kids to two of the Arkansas residential programs that were mentioned in the report and at the hearing, which the Bangor Daily News surfaced in their own reporting after the report came out. I said report a lot there. Bangor Daily News reported about the report that came out from the Senate Finance Committee, just to be clear. And that prompted concern from several state lawmakers serving on a Blue Ribbon Commission around, reform and improvement of the Human Services Department in general in Maine, who promptly hauled child welfare officials in to testify about how they were going to ensure that Maine youth are not harmed inside these facilities. I'm not going to project too far out, but I would not be totally surprised if you see a story sometime soon, the Bangor and Daily News, that says that Maine has removed those kids from those Arkansas facilities. Maybe not, we'll see. But I just wanted to kind of call it out as a sort of way to demonstrate that, it's not always clear, or there's not always, a direct line between what happens at these congressional hearings and, effective change. We'll see if there's any sort of major legislation that comes out of, that Senate Finance Committee investigation on the federal level. But that just the simple presence of that, the coverage of it, yielded reporting on the local level, and that local reporting yielded some action already from Maine lawmakers. So I guess we will see what comes of that. And I do think also, if I had to guess one thing that we will see some action on this year when it comes to residential care, it's going to be some scrutiny around out-of-state placements. The imprint in San Francisco Chronicle reported on the use of out-of-state placements by California a couple of years ago, kind of lifted up the fact that while California has prided itself on kind of limiting its use of residential care and holding state providers of group care to a higher standard, the state was allowing counties to, basically not live up to those standards, I guess, when it came to moving kids out of state to put them with, contracted providers elsewhere. And, basically the fallout from that reporting was that the state banned out-of-state placements that came with some funding to counties to develop other alternatives inside the state. So we're very keen to see if this conversation comes up in other states like Maine, where there is still a lot of movement of kids, particularly in residential care, from one state to the next. Definitely is happening in quite a few places. We move from Capitol Hill to California. They got two California headlines to raise up here, and I think both are worth knowing about outside of the state. One as perhaps a new model for foster care payments that maybe other states will take notice of and think about. And the other as a kind of unfortunate harbinger of maybe problems to come for the provision of foster care. So I'll start with that first one. California lawmakers have approved a $1 billion plan aimed at ensuring that foster youth have access to enrichment activities like swim classes, after-school sports, music lessons, and then specialized therapy to address trauma and other things, and then some help with housing when they leave government custody as young adults. This all moved as this one legislative plan. This will not take effect for 3 years, but when that happens, the new approach is going to triple the state's investment in the provision of foster care. And by that, it doesn't necessarily mean in terms of cash paid to the foster care providers. It's more of an investment in the quality of foster care services for the children that are in it. So there's kind of two new facets of the support that California is kind of proposing here. One is called the strengths building portion. I have heard that all often referred to as normalcy, just trying to make sure that there's funding available to ensure that foster youth are able to do all kinds of extracurricular things and opportunities that any other kid might be able to. So that will provide between $500 and $900 a month for those extracurricular activities. The money doesn't go right to caregivers, or it's kind of like a third-party entity, similar to like a pay service that manages, Social Security or veterans benefit payments, that would disperse the money according to the young person's wishes and needs. And then there's another new pot of money for immediate needs and for some young people, and that's more this delivery of community-based agency services, things like culturally appropriate wraparound care and other sort of health-related or mental health-related services. So that is perhaps a positive on the horizon for how foster care works in California. It's 3 years down the road. But in the short term, there is a fairly dramatic cliff approaching for the nonprofit foster family agencies, often just referred to as FFAs in the state, that account for thousands of California's foster homes. And what I mean by account for is they recruit, they help to license and train, and then they manage foster homes. This is not abnormal. Obviously, there's probably in every state some amount of foster home management and oversight that is carried out by nonprofits through contracts with counties or with state systems. So we put together a little explainer that I'll share in the show notes. You should read that, but I'm just going to do a very quick synopsis of this pretty complicated problem. In order to operate as a foster family agency, basically the nonprofit has to have some level of liability insurance available to it in case it gets sued. Now, ensuring the liability of these nonprofits has not been a popular or attractive thing in the insurance market for a while, which is why there is basically one insurer for almost all of the 200 or so FFAs in California. And that insurer, which is the Nonprofit Insurance Alliance of California, or NIAC, sought changes in legislation to put some guardrails in place, some new ones, around the pursuit of lawsuits against foster family agencies. I'm trying to keep it pretty 50,000 feet here in this. I did a much more thorough job in the explainer, so you should definitely read that. They saw some changes, around the timelines for basically when, a lawsuit, like somebody could demand a settlement from them, or what has to happen before a jury could even consider making an award or rendering a verdict against a foster family agency when abuse is claimed and things like that. So that legislation was introduced and moved through the California Assembly, and at which point it was kind of gutted and replaced basically with legislation that was not satisfactory to NIAC. I'm not passing judgment either way here. I'm just trying to explain what happened. They sought legislation to create a market that they could continue to operate in. And the legislation that has moved on the Senate side thus far, in their opinion, does not meet that. So when that happened, when the original legislation got gutted, NIAC announced that it was not going to renew its insurance policies for any of its foster family agency clients effective at the end of September. And what that means in a very short order, probably by December 31st, is that a lot of them, I think it's something around 50, are no longer going to have insurance. That insurance will lapse, and they will almost certainly be forced to close unless something happens. So there's a lot of things on the table. We walk you through a few of the potential outcomes here in the explainer. So I would go and check that out if you would like to read up on this. Now, we're talking ultimately with the provision of foster family agency homes about something around 9,000 kids that are living in those homes. It's a very significant portion of the licensed foster homes in the state. So, is this a California problem? Right now it is. But, just a few folks I spoke with in New York and elsewhere, as I was kind of putting this explainer together, said, there's already a pretty low number of insurers in their markets as well. And same kind of conditions are afoot with the insurance markets there. And so let's just say I don't think it would be crazy to expect that there may be other states that are seeing this cliff coming sometime soon as well. And in fact, as I was discussing this with California officials of various paths, a few have told me, we definitely know that there are people from other states, our colleagues in other states, who are paying attention to what's happening here with this. All right, well, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back with a little rapid round of some more headlines.
Before I was adopted, I felt like my life was already over.
My biggest fear was that I would age out and not know how to be sufficient on my own.
At a certain age, they don't want you, you're troubled and stuff.
The clock is ticking for the more than 125,000 kids waiting to be adopted from foster care. Help the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption prevent them from aging out without a permanent family. Learn more at davethomasfoundation.org.
All right, let's whip through a few more headlines. We left off with a deep dive into a few things going on in California. Let's do the same for New York. One piece of legislation that's moved through to the desk of the governor there, and then one court case that I think both would be of interest, obviously to New Yorkers, but outside as well. On the legislative front, New York appears to be, and could be if Kathy Hochul, the governor, signs this bill, the first state to really put in a structure to basically patrol adoption subsidies, which are often paid for in a mix between state funds and federal funds through Title IV-E. Now, the federal government has several listed reasons as to why an adoption subsidy to an adoptive parent. Well, let me back up. When you adopt out of foster care, most states make it, I believe all states really have some availability of adoption subsidies. And like I said, that's paid for in kind of a mix of state and federal funds. And, per federal rules, there are, several reasons why an adoption subsidy could be cut off. Obviously, when a young person turns the age of majority, that can end the subsidies. If there's clear evidence that there is no relationship anymore, and essentially either the adoptive family has abandoned them or they've moved out or left the home for various reasons. There's a couple of other ones that are just not coming to mind right now. But here's the thing. There's no real requirement that states actually see about any of that. And most states, really all states, do not. So what's going on in New York is this legislation that would, terminate state funds paid to parents who could not provide proof to child welfare agencies that adopted children are still under their care. So it's really the first proactive, it would put in place the first kind of proactive patrol of this. And we'll see what happens. We'll update listeners if that in fact becomes law. I know that is something in the state, and we're going to have Dawn Post on. We've had her on in the past. She worked on the Broken Adoptions Project in New York City for a long time. That is something that she has really been a champion on, really focusing on the what happens when, kids bomb out of these adoptive placements and they're left on their own with no support. And meanwhile, there's still a subsidy going nominally to take care of them to an adoptive parent. Okay, so that's the legislative side. There was also an interesting ruling, and I will preface this by saying obviously state laws vary from place to place, but I did think that this was interesting. So basically there was a case, and as always, go to the show notes to read the full story because our reporters do a lot better job explaining it in detail than I do on the podcast. But just in a nutshell here, the Family First Act, which we have talked about over and over again, puts in place some funds on the front end, federal funds for foster care prevention. On the back end, it limited the use of congregate care, or it limited the use of federal funds for congregate care to 2 weeks with some notable exceptions. And one of those exceptions were qualified residential treatment programs. And those are supposed to be, kind of a higher order of clinical care provided in a residential setting. And they're really supposed to be kind of the primary exception whereby you could use federal money to pay for residential care for more than 2 weeks. Anyway, I say all that in the context of this case because, there were things put in place that are supposed to ensure that when states are using these qualified residential treatment programs or QRTPs, there are some safeguards in place to really make sure that there's scrutiny as to whether kids really need to be there. And one of those things is that judges have to continue to sign off, pretty periodically over the course of a year on an agency keeping a kid and then actually at the 12-month mark, I believe, the state child welfare director actually has to put their name on it and say that we have reviewed and approved that this young person is best left in a residential care setting for this long. So what happened in this case in New York is that a judge said, no, this child does not need to still be in residential care. And the agency appealed it in court, basically asserting that it is not a judge's place to say that. So advocates for youth appealed that assertion in court, and a state appeals court has agreed in a notable ruling that was issued over the summer, which you can read about in the imprint. I will drop a link for you so you can get into the weeds of it. But basically, the important takeaway was it was an affirmation that, yes, judges, at least in New York, have the ultimate say. It is not, it is not defensible to say that a child welfare agency has the unchecked power to assert where a child is going to live within foster care. All right, home stretch here. I just want to do a few shout outs to stories. I'll just do quick summaries of them. No real big details, mostly of the imprint. But, I wanted to call out first some great reporting that the Miami Herald did over the summer under the headline, Florida teens get longer prison sentences than adults, which really says it all. But here's some more detail from that story. I'm just going to read a quick section of it. Children tried as adults were sentenced to a little more than 3 years in prison on average for third-degree felonies, around 50% longer than the average sentence given to adults for the same class of offense. The vast majority of all felony charges are third-degree offenses, which are the lowest class of felony crimes and include burglary, some types of assault, drug possession, and certain DUI offenses. Children and adults had similar average sentences for more serious offenses that fall under first and second degree felonies. Overall, a child tried as an adult was sentenced to a little more than 5 years for a felony charge, while an adult received around 3.5 years. These trends held even after the Herald adjusted for the most extreme sentences that could skew the figures. And they quote right after that a former family court judge, Lynn Tepper, who was from Florida's 6th Judicial Court, who reviewed the Herald's findings and said that they were very, very disturbing. And indeed, I would have to agree that that is the case. So this speaks obviously to the one way in which there are still many youth who are involved in the adult court system, and that is by being waived into it for certain crimes. In some states like Florida, prosecutors have a lot of discretion in that. In other states, it's a legislative thing where there are certain crimes and offenses where it's mandated. Sometimes it's a judge that can decide. But this was a lot of novel reporting and great data gathering by the Herald. So I would highly recommend checking that story out if you are interested in youth justice issues, in particular, the transfer of youth into adult court and what happens afterwards. Another way that youth are involved in the adult court process is if states simply view them as adults in the eyes of the law jurisdictionally. And over the course of, the past decade or so, many states have done something that has come to be known as raising the age to shield more and more youths from sort of innate adult court involvement. And they do that by, basically there were a lot of states that at some point viewed 17-year-olds entirely to be adults as far as the criminal justice system, or in some states it was even 16. Most of those states came to raise the age to just basically have all people under 18 considered juveniles in the eyes of the law. There were only 3 states that did not have that to be the case. It was Texas, Georgia, and Wisconsin were the 3 states who considered 17-year-olds to be adults. And in the past 2 years, as my colleague here at the imprint, Jeremy Loudenbeck, reports in this story, there are 2 other states have joined them, Louisiana and North Carolina, both of whom raised the age in recent years, went back and lowered the age. So now, again, in those 2 states, 17-year-olds are considered adults in the eyes of the law. And I'll drop the link for Jeremy's story in there. I want to recommend 2 articles written by Alex Perez, our full-time Minnesota reporter on child welfare issues. He profiled a second chance program that is offered to Minnesota parents who have previously lost kids to CPS. This is a really interesting program and an interesting issue. Obviously, a lot of people in child welfare know that when a parent has lost their parental rights to one child when they give birth to another, it is often protocol to remove that child as well. This program sort of tries to stem that tide by proactively engaging the mom early in taking steps to prevent that from happening. And then the other one from Alex is a great look at the sort of children and families record of late for governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz, who I think most people know is the vice presidential candidate on the Democratic ticket right now. And last but not least for this week, I really want to recommend that people read a great story reported beautifully by R. Michael Fitzgerald that looks at a graveside ceremony for girls who died and were buried on the grounds of what is now a men's prison, but back in the day was New York's House of Refuge and the New York State Training School for Girls. Many of the girls who were sent to these grounds were labeled as incorrigible due to sexual activity or pregnancies they'd experienced Others were sent because they were victims of their parents' abuse. And while the traits of, a progressive approach to youth justice and youth work were there, it's a leafy outdoor environment, and they had a school-like setting. The use of restraints and isolation and racial segregation really color the past of these two facilities. So over the summer, a gathering of artists and historians and writers and state officials honored the memory of these girls with a graveside ceremony. One girl who spent time in the training school in the 70s, Cynthia Boykin, was present for this and spoke to Michael along with other people that attended. And I'm just going to end with Cynthia's comment to Michael. By uncovering this difficult history, we hope to spark important conversations about how society can better support young women today. So again, really recommend you read it. It was just a tremendous job that Michael did on this story. That is going to do it for this week's episode. We'll be back with guest interviews starting next week. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or Safe Camp Audio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Onjoko with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elliott. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you'd consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is super easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews, and you can visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always get us over email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we will see you next week.